Good afternoon, everyone. No, really, it's okay to have audience participation. Good afternoon, everyone. Will, I want to say especially to you, blessings on your ministry. You're built for this. You've been trained for this. I'm excited for you. So I hope things all go well. Well, I'd like to begin with a question. Have you ever been promised something that took a long time to be fulfilled? Or perhaps even still remains unfulfilled? Or maybe a promise has been made to you, but in light of any number of situations and circumstances, you cannot for the life of you see how that promise is ever going to be fulfilled in your lifetime, or for that matter, your children's or even your grandchildren's lifetime. Now, I know that none of you in here know that I'm an Iowa farm kid because I don't think I've ever mentioned it to anybody. Okay, I pretty much mentioned it to everybody. In fact, I think everyone in Canada knows by now that I'm an Iowa farm kid. But when I consider questions like this, I often will return to that primary socialization that I have growing up on the farm. And I think about those times when I was a young kid out working the land with my grandfather or my dad. My grandpa used to actually, my Grandpa D, that's what we call him, Grandpa D. He used to come and to the farm, he'd drive from in town, which is about 5 miles out, and he'd bring a stack of 5-gallon buckets, all, stacked up together. And he'd bring them out there and he'd say, "All right, Jim, let's go to the field. Today, you're going to fill these buckets with rocks." And that was my job, picking up the rocks so that the equipment wouldn't be damaged. One of the fun things about that is that I learned pretty quickly, you can find 2 relatively large rocks and put them in, this is, fit in the top of the bucket. If you get 2 of them, you can fill a bucket. And my grandpa paid 25 cents a bucket for me to fill with rocks. He got a kick out of that. Sometimes I'd be out with my dad, and usually those jobs were a little bit more boring. "Today, Jim, you're going to fix that fence." Okay, that sounds great. And what I mean by fix that fence is tear out the old one so I can put in the new one with the tractor. Okay, great. So I always got the fun jobs with my dad. My brother was never around during those times. I can't figure that one out. But what would happen invariably when working with one of those guys or the other is they would take a moment to say, "Hey, look up. Look around at this land. What do you see?" And I'd start naming off, well, that's the 120. That's what we call one of our pastures. There's 160. That was another one. And I'd start naming them. And invariably they would say, "Someday, this will all be yours." Now, of course, yours was plural to include both my brother and my sister and all my cousins and everybody else in my family, it seemed like. Nevertheless, a promise of inheritance was made, and with an air of great certainty, I might add. Hearing these words when I was young and impressionable, say 10, 11, 12 years old, tended to spark my imagination. So I would go to one of my favorite places on the farm. I'd managed to figure out how to climb on top of the cattle barn, which sat out by the lot, is up on a hill. And I figured out that I could climb up the gate and I could shimmy up the pole or the post, and I could manage to hoist myself up on the roof. And I would go to the highest point on this. Don't worry, it wasn't too steep of a pitch. And I would sit right on the top of this building and I'd just look out because you could have a great view of the farmland. And I remember just kind of going off into this daydream about my future life on the farm, carrying on the family business, and more importantly, carrying on the family name. And I'd think about all this stuff in a relatively carefree manner, not really considering, or for that matter, even having a clue about the multifarious difficulties that were already challenging and that would continue to challenge the fulfillment of the promises that my grandfather and my dad had made to me. Not to mention those challenges that could someday challenge me and my brother and my sister and my cousins if we indeed ever do receive the land. I loved those daydreams. I have very fond memories. And then came July 1981. If you are an economist or an historian, you probably are well aware that July 1981 marked the beginning of the worst economic downturn in the United States, at least to that point, since the Great Depression. Economists and historians say that that recession only lasted until November of 1982, so July 81 to November 82, but I can tell you from personal experience that the aftershocks of that recession were felt for quite some time afterwards, especially among small family farms and small businesses in rural communities. Hence the farm crisis of the 1980s. Perhaps you're familiar with it. This crisis was named because people were leaving the farming business in droves. In fact, people who had farms in their families' names for a century or longer were actually giving up those farms and trying to move off somewhere in order to make a dime. It got to the point where the American society, at least, and maybe it reached as far as Canada, I'm not sure, but at least American society at large became quite concerned with this farm crisis. And that in turn sparked a number of social events. One memorable one was in 1985. Keep in mind, the recession only went to 1982. But as far as to 1985, they had an event called Farm Aid. Now, you may have never heard of Farm Aid, but in case you're interested, it was a 6-week-long concert. And I believe it was in Champaign, Illinois, where this concert was held. 6 weeks long. It entertained, they estimate, somewhere around 80,000 people. And it raised somewhere in the vicinity of $7 million of aid money for farmers. Backtrack to the late 70s for a moment. In the late 70s, my dad and my mom could see that a train wreck was coming. So in an effort to protect the family farm and feed us kids, I guess we had to eat, right? My dad bought into a sandblasting and spray painting business. And eventually he became the sole proprietor, at which point, in the small town of Bagley in rural west central Iowa, he opened a paint and hardware store, and he called it, of course, Central Iowa Paint. My dad was great with names like that, very descriptive. The sandblasting and spray painting business managed somehow to maintain its viability, but by 1982, the hardware store was seriously in jeopardy, seriously hurting, mainly because its primary clientele were farmers. And during that time, as I've already intimated, most farmers were either unwilling or they were unable to open their wallets. That year, 1982, which just so happens to have been Bagley's centennial year. This is amazing. You can't write it any better than this. It was the centennial year, and then later that year in 1982, Bagley started to see its businesses close. Not a huge town by any stretch of the imagination. But when the first business to go out, the local grocery store, went, it basically meant that people had to drive at least 20 miles to buy groceries. Even more devastating was when, in 1984, the Gilland Implement, which is the international harvester tractor and implement dealer that had been in operation in Bagley since 1948, which was the year my parents were born, closed its doors, ceased operations. Although the sandblasting and painting business barely remained afloat as a result of a major change in its business model, my dad was smart enough to move away from doing residential, kind of having a residential commercial base, customer base rather, to a commercial, doing commercial jobs. My parents still were forced to close that hardware store in 1983. All these things, including a front row seat to my parents' stress and anxiety during this time, occurred at a very formative age and stage in my life. It was during this period of difficulty that I had honestly begun to doubt that the promise to inherit the farm was ever going to come true. How could it? with all of the closures and the foreclosures that were going on around us. I couldn't see past those troubles and past those difficulties and trust that it could happen. To state it kind of in the parlance of our chapel theme this year, I'd become distracted, even blinded by the troublesome events in my imminent frame. And when this sort of thing happens, it typically has a negative impact on one's hope or trust, and it may even negatively affect one's loyalty and the ways in which they live their lives. In the case of Bagley, a lot of people started leaving. They started moving away. And Bagley went from a town of a couple of thousand people to, well, let's just say in 2020 at the census, there were 233 people that were counted. I'm reminded here of our forebears in the faith who were addressed in the letter that we know simply as to the Hebrews. From the letter, we can discern that the addressees in the early days of their enlightenment were full of great zeal, full of boldness, such boldness that despite enduring tremendous struggle and various kinds of suffering, they did so with joy, operating on the assumption that they already had a better and lasting possession. Hebrews 10:32-34. But their imminent frame, the quote-unquote natural order of their everyday, so to speak, continued to be filled with ever-increasing difficulty, troubles, and suffering. Soon they too had become blinded by imminence, with the result that their hope, their trust in God had waned, and in turn, their faithfulness or loyalty was starting to take a hit as well. So the writer of Hebrews set about to encourage the addressees not to throw away the boldness that they had exhibited early on, chapter 10, verse 35, but to maintain both their hope in and loyalty to God, which would result in the preservation of their souls as opposed to drawing back and ending up destroyed. 10:39. By rehearsing the stories about a number of key faithful exemplars in their ancestry in chapter 11, the writer legitimates the value of enduring commitment, faith, or faithfulness. And that faith is in and faithfulness is toward God, and it's grounded in trusting the Transcendent One, or as is sometimes said in the Hebrew Bible, putting your hope in the Lord and in his word. Let's take a look at Hebrews 11, just very briefly, look at a few highlights from the text. I'd like to begin with how the writer describes faith or faithfulness in verses 1-3. Now, I will note here that verse 1 has always been a little bit tricky for people because there's some challenging terms to define in it, so I'll offer you at least my transinterpretation, if I can put it that way. Beginning in 11, verse 1. Now, faith or faithfulness is the embodiment or the realization of what is hoped for. It is establishing the actions or the deeds that are not seen. Indeed, the ancients were commended by this sort of faithfulness. By faith, we perceive or understand the ages to have been created by the word of God, so that what is seen did not come about from what is already visible. Right away, we see the writer attempting to get the addressees to lift their eyes above the imminent frame and to fix them upon God. Note that he's not trying to convince them that God exists. That's a given. Instead, he points out that the Transcendent One is and always has been actively working, even if his deeds are not or not always visible within the imminent frame. Note, too, the sort of reciprocal relationship that the writer seems to create between faith and the yet-to-be-seen realities that are hoped for and trusted to come about. These latter realities substantiate faith as a kind of proof that faith is well-founded, while at the same time, faith or faithfulness realizes the yet-to-be-seen realities, bringing them into some sort of visible existence. Without faith, the yet-to-be-seen realities never materialize, whereas by faith, the reality of the as-yet unseen goods or events are demonstrated. Maybe colloquially, if I may, the author seems to be saying in these verses that faith or faithfulness is what makes what is hoped for real. And given what's about to unfold in the rest of chapter 11, we might even add the parenthetical comment, and actionable. What unfolds here in chapter 11 is reminiscent, to me at least, of James's teaching that faith is to be expressed, it's to be shown, demonstrated through one's actions, even if those actions don't make much sense given what's in one's imminent frame. This is the type of faith for which the ancients were commended, we're told in 11 verse 2. Now, clearly, we don't have enough time to look through every one of the exemplars, some whom are named and others that are not. Let's highlight a few features of several kind of well-known ones that are listed in chapter 11. First off, verse 7, Noah. By faith, Noah, having been warned about things not yet seen, being obedient, constructed an ark for the salvation of his household. And the writer goes on to say he became an heir of righteousness, which is in accordance with faith or faithfulness. I want you to pick up on and note very carefully the language, having been warned about things not seen, not yet realized. And yet, receiving this message, Noah doesn't sit around and go, well, can you prove that this stuff's going to happen? Can you make a logical case for it? The text says he was obedient. He acted. Abraham and Sarah are pointed out in this text as well. Verses 8 through 12, and then again 17 through 19. Starting in verse 8, by faith, when he was called, Abraham obeyed to go out into the place which he was intended to receive for an inheritance, and he went out despite not knowing where he was going. He didn't have his GPS on, I guess. Or did he? By faith, he lived as a stranger in the land of promise, as if living in a foreign land, living in tents with Isaac and Jacob, who were fellow heirs of the same promise. For he was awaiting, perhaps even anticipating, the city that has foundations, of which the architect and builder is God. Please note again some of the language that's used here. He went out despite not knowing where he was going. And when he was called to go to this place where he didn't know where he was going, he acted, he did it, he obeyed. He didn't get stuck in his imminent frame and argue and ask, well, I need a roadmap. How do I know I've gotten there? Can you prove to me that this really will be the promised land? Instead, he awaited and anticipated the city that has foundations. 11, verse 11, by faith, also the infertile woman Sarah herself received the ability to become pregnant, yet she was beyond menopause, since she reckoned reliable the one who made the promise. Therefore, even from one they were fathered, and these from one who was dead were just like the stars of the sky in the multitude, and as innumerable as the sand along the shore of the sea. Please note the language. She reckoned reliable, faithful, the one who made the promise. 11 verses 17 and 18. By faith, Abraham, when he was tested, offered Isaac, the one who received the promises, to whom it was spoken, through Isaac your offspring will be called. That one offered his only begotten, as he reckoned that God is able to raise a person even from the dead. Whence, in a manner of speaking, he did receive him. I don't know how many times, if ever, Abraham saw people raised from the dead. It's not really indicated in any of the stories that I'm aware of around Abraham. He goes into the situation trusting that God is going to do something. And he acts. Some of my favorites when you get to Moses' parents and to Moses, verses 23 to 28, starting in 23, by faith, Moses, when he was born, was hidden for 3 months by his parents because they saw that the child was beautiful. And I love this part. They were not afraid of the king's edict. Talk about getting your eyes out of the imminent frame. Here they are in a place where Pharaoh has got all this power and he's made this edict, and they didn't get stuck staring at that and blinded by that. The writer continues in verse 24, by faith, Moses, when he became older, refused to consider himself a son of the Pharaoh's daughter. Verse 25, preferring more to be a fellow sufferer with the people of God than to have the temporary enjoyment of sin, considering slander for the sake of the Messiah of greater wealth than the treasure of Egypt. For he was turning his attention to the reward. Towards the end of chapter 10, in the context, the writer says that God is a recompenser, if I can use that big multisyllabic oldish word, a rewarder of those who seek him. Here's Moses turning his attention to God and to the reward. Verse 27, by faith, he left Egypt, not being afraid of the king's wrath. Note, his parents, they were not afraid of the king's edict. Now Moses, not being afraid of the king's wrath. Like parents, like child. For he persevered with respect to the unseen one, as though seeing him. His eyes were not stuck in the imminent frame. By faith, he made the Passover sacrifice and sprinkling of blood so that the destroyer would not touch their firstborn. Did they know who or what this destroyer was? He received the instructions on how this is all to go down. He obeyed, followed it, and he acted, trusting God. Not looking at the Egyptians in the rearview mirror. Note again that in each of these cases, the ones who were praised for their faithfulness were in situations where they could have easily been blinded by imminence, and as a result have missed both what God was doing and the opportunity to be part of it. But instead of fixing their eyes on all of the challenges and all of the difficulties surrounding them, they acted on the basis of their hope in God, and God turned those hopes into a reality. But there's one more thing I want you to notice in this text that further exemplifies the kind of commendable faith that the writer wants the addressees to adopt. Look at the summary statement about the patriarch's faithfulness. Verse 13. All these died in accordance with faith, although not having received the promises, but recognizing them from a distance and anticipating them and acknowledging that they were strangers and transients upon the earth. For those who speak such things, that is, those who acknowledge that they're strangers and transients upon the earth, reveal that they're seeking a homeland. And indeed, if they were reminiscing about that homeland from which they had departed, by the way, there's a second-class condition used here to deny this. If they were reminiscing about that homeland to go back there, they weren't. But if they were, but as it were, rather, they were desiring a better homeland that is a heavenly homeland. Therefore, God was not ashamed of them to be called their God. And indeed, he prepared a city for them. Look also at the summary at the conclusion of the exemplary list. Verse 39, all these, although being commended through faith, did not receive the promise, given that God had opted in advance for something better for us, such that they would not be made complete apart from us. And I guess you could say by implication, we would not be made complete apart from them. What's interesting to me in all of this is that you have groups of these ancestors of our faith who lived by that faith and by their hope and trust in God, despite the fact that many of them were coming to the ends of their lives. They may not have been sure about, is the promise going to be fulfilled in my children's lives, grandchildren's lives? It doesn't matter. God is still working his promises. Don't get stuck in the imminent frame. Don't be blinded by the troubles. Put your hope and your full trust in God. Even if now for a little while you've had to suffer various trials. So that the genuineness of your faith, being more precious than gold, that though perishable is tested by fire, may be found to result in praise and glory and honor when Jesus Christ is revealed. Although you have not seen him, you love him. And even though you do not see him now, you believe in him and rejoice with an indescribable and glorious joy. For you are receiving the outcome of your faith, the salvation of your souls.